you have a tremendous presence on TikTok. I don't even have the TikTok app, but through connections, someone texted me a video. I'm thinking, well, I can't even open this. I'm not on TikTok. Let me try it anyway. I clicked on it. And obviously, some of your videos are extremely hilarious, very easy to follow, and so profound. It's like you're able to deliver extremely profound concepts that everybody can relate. If they're in the world of work, they can relate to it. And it's just darn funny. And I also feel like, too, with the really funny videos, you're really saying things that everybody else is thinking. They just haven't said it yet. And so well done on that, and also well done on your book, Happy at Work: How to Create a Happy, Engaging Workplace for Today's and Tomorrow's Workforce. And this is out right now. People can get it. Super excited about that. But just high level, tell us about you, who you are, what you do, and how you got to be here.
So I've been in leadership for a long time. I became a manager first when I was 22 years old. So that was many years ago now. And, I've always worked with leaders of all ages, of all levels, especially young leaders. I love to work with new leaders or aspiring leaders. And one of the things that I think is funny about workplace culture is that you could say the same thing over and over again, and people might think about it, they might try to adapt their behavior. I find that the satire is particularly effective because people want to be taken seriously. So if we can poke a little bit of fun at some of the common manager tropes, I find that we get a lot of really good response with that.
Yeah, that's awesome. So Gallup says, and I think everybody's familiar with this poll from years ago. But Gallup says that only 15% of the entire workforce can be put into the category of actively engaged, which means that 85% of all workers are not engaged. How much of that do you think is the result of bad workplace culture?
I think the majority of it is the result of that workplace culture. We'll talk specifically about that. But I do think that the other part is our expectations. I know we talk about an engaged workforce. I know we talk about the different ways that we measure that and the different definitions of that. But it is important to recognize that for some people, they are very heavily invested in their work. It's part of their identity. They love it. Fantastic. Um, However, it doesn't work if those people then look at other people and they say, well, why don't other people feel the way that I do? And I bet you that if you looked at that 15% and you looked at the percent that are in executive leadership or, special roles, that there's probably pretty heavy overlap. And there are some reasons for that too. One is, wow, those people are getting very highly compensated. No wonder they're so enthusiastic. And the other is that they definitely want to be here. They worked really hard to be here. And so here they are. So part of it is that we can't look at the entire workforce and expect 100% of them to say, I love my job. That's not necessarily realistic. What we can do is we can say, okay, what does a good, solid, healthy culture look like? And how do we ensure that every person here feels like they belong, feels like they have good, solid opportunities, feels fairly compensated? Those are the things that we realistically can do.
Yeah, and there's a trend that I've noticed increasing over the last 5, 10, 15 years. And you touch on it in your book, and it's near the beginning of your book. You highlight the dangers of doing more with less,
Yeah.
and you talk about its long-term impact on workplace culture. And I'll tell you why this section really resonated with me. In the introduction of my book, Make Work Better, I talk about the difference between companies whose leaders operate on a self-made basis versus those that prioritize being self-aware in their leadership, and how this difference typically manifests itself. And for those that never get away from trying to be self-made always, you'll notice that things like bootstrapped and wearing many hats never goes away. It's like a persistent. It's like, well, this company's been around for 25 years. Why are we still bootstrapping and wearing many hats? Um,
Yeah.
but when you talk about this danger of doing more with less, how did that start, and how does the danger typically manifest itself within the workplace?
The origin of the current do more with less movement definitely has come from everything kind of since the 2008 recession. There was a period where businesses just started cutting. They cut jobs, they cut resources, they cut programs, they cut and cut and cut. And many of those things never came back. Whole positions that used to exist never came back. And so what we've seen is that businesses think, wow, that looks really great. Once you make those cuts, it's hard to then get to the types of resources that you had before. So not only has that occurred, but we've now seen it play out over a very prolonged period of time. So even though the economy has changed many times since that time period, we've had some pretty big economic booms, we've had other recessions, and we're in the interesting place that we're at now, there's still less now than there was before. And just because everything went online doesn't mean you don't still need the same types of resources. You might just need different people with different skills. You might need to approach those in different ways. But it's very common. You see it, obviously, you see it in startups, you see it in corporations. I've talked to some corporations just this week who you would think would be big, stable entities. And yet they've got tons of positions that they haven't replaced. I talked to one that has thousands and thousands of people in a location and almost no open positions. And that math just doesn't add up. So they've got a lot of interesting, strange things that they're doing internally, picking someone up, putting them into another position, sliding people. There's a lot of whiplash, a lot of disruption. That doesn't necessarily have to be the case. And so people feel really unstable, they feel really confused, and they feel really frustrated because they know what they need. And they've told their boss. People come to me all the time and they say, I've told my boss that we don't have enough people to manage this part of the process. And it keeps coming back on us over and over again. What should I do? And so we have to talk about that because it is difficult. If executive leadership is very far away from the realities of the process, then how do you explain to them, here's what we really need here. If your expectations are that this is going to go flawlessly, then this is what we need to administer that.
If you had asked me 20 years ago or more, actually, because I was 22, 25 years ago, was in the workforce at that point. If you'd asked me back then, like, what's my least favorite thing in any workplace, I would have told you my supervisors and their tendency to micromanage. And I mean micromanage in the most microscopic manner. Like, your computer keyboard must be here. You must sit in your chair at your desk this way. And I'm not talking about this was an assembly, like I'm talking about white collar work here, a desk job, This is how much micromanagement was, quite frankly, back 20 plus years ago, was very accepted. And so what I would say is, and this is also part of the reason why, in my book, my subtitle never wavered. Like, Make Work Better was like the third or fourth different title idea that I'd had, but the subtitle from the very beginning was always how empowered teams transform work and deliver better results, not how micromanaged teams transform work and deliver better results. So, but in the first chapter of Happy at Work, you have a section titled Stop Micromanaging. So talk about how micromanagement continues to be a problem and why it's so detrimental to the workplace.
It's very detrimental to the workplace. So think about the corporate workplace, right? We live in a talent economy. So everybody's competing for the most talented, most hardworking, most creative individuals. And so we look high and low to find those people, put them into these positions. And then what you see a bad boss do is they'll come in and they'll micromanage them, which just doesn't make any sense. If that was going to happen, you should have gone down a different path. The hiring plan should have been different. So we fill up these teams with people who are very qualified, who have great experience, who worked very hard to get here. And then we treat them like children, which just doesn't make any sense. I think the place that this comes from is people think about themselves and they think about, okay, this is what I like. This is what works for me. As a leader, you have to recognize you're working with lots of different types of people. So the technique of I'm going to teach you how I do it only works in very limited circumstances. Again, if we're doing something that's routine, repetitive, then sure. Now, if you're doing something where you want to share your experiences and your skills, you can do a lot of coaching with that. But things like, this is how you should take notes in this meeting. This is where you should store this particular file. A lot of those things are a total waste of time. And it's very easy to get sucked into things like that. As a leader, you have to be cautious because it's not a good use of your time. You'll frustrate the person that you're working with. You'll frustrate yourself because now you've put the standard on the table saying, I want you to do exactly this. And if that doesn't work for the other person, then there's this total mismatch. So what are we really doing here? You have to think about a couple of things. Who are you working with? And what do you need them to be able to do? And then once you understand those two things, what resources are needed and what kind of goals do we need to set? Focus on the goals and the resources, not so much on the day-to-day nitpicky stuff, and you'll have much, much more success.
One of my favorite leadership experts, I don't know that he would refer to himself as a leadership expert, but his name's Bob Beal. He had a quote, I don't know if it was original with him, but he used to use it a lot. He would say, it's probably a Peter Druckerism, but manage results, not activity. So it sounds a little bit like that. And you mentioned the folders thing too. It's hilarious because one of the examples I could have given you when I talked about being micromanaged more than 20 years ago was, yes, for the projects that you're working on, this is before things got highly digitized. You must keep this color folder with this justified tab, and you must put this size label and this font and this size. And like, it's seriously like the micromanagement was manifest in that way as well.
Yeah.
So actually one of my favorite leadership authors is a guy by the name of Tim Elmore. And full disclosure, I had a chance to help him launch his latest book last year. It's called A New Kind of Diversity, and it was a book about generational diversity in the workplace. He's been dealing in the world of work, workplaces for more than a decade now. And so you talk about generational diversity in chapter 9 of your book. It's in a section titled, I love this, Calm the Generational Wars. Now, I think, Robyn, I think you nailed it when you said what I think is perhaps the cause of all of the strife that we see and the slowdown and productivity and the disharmony that we see in workplaces when it comes to the generations not always getting along, or not so much they don't get along, they don't understand what each other are saying. It's like they all speak a different language.
Yes.
But you said each generation has grown up in a completely different world that was profound, it was succinct. So talk more about the differences in the generations and what were some of the milestones that shaped each generation's worldview and how that approaches or how that affects their approach to work.
The worldview part, I think, is the part people maybe don't think about as much. You think about, okay, people have come around and they've seen different trends, different time periods, different arts and culture, even different historical events. But one of the things about the historical events is that then that impacts the generation and how they're going to feel, how they see the world. Interestingly, when I did the research for this part of the book, there was only one historical event that all generations identified as being a major impact on their lives, and this was in America, obviously, and that was 9/11. And so you can see that that was a very game-changing moment for all the generations that were alive at that time. But for everybody, if you look at the individual generations, you've got things like Watergate, you've got things like the Vietnam War, you've got all these different sorts of activities, the different economic conditions that have existed. If you grow up in a time of economic prosperity, you're going to have different feelings and different values than if you grow up in a time of economic struggle. And we've seen so much change on that front across the years. So even though we've all been here, we're all existing in the same place, our perspective on it is different. And that obviously comes all the way down to the individual level, but there are generational trends that are pretty common. So then you've got all these generations, they've come into the workforce, right? And it's an interesting time because the millennial generation has been in the workforce now for 20 years, right? And you've got more and more Gen Z folks coming into the workforce, and eventually we'll get the Gen Alpha folks who are coming into the workforce. And I think you can go back significantly further and look at each of the prior generations and say, well, what happened? what's really interesting is we've got all this wisdom that gets passed down, and it sort of happens in two ways. The first one is that there's the intentional, right? I come in and I'm going to say to you, okay, here's what you need to know about the workplace. Here's how you can be successful here. But there's also the sort of unconscious portion of that. A lot of information about the workplace gets passed along unconsciously, and each generation internalizes that differently. I think up to now, we've seen them internalize it quite a bit because the message has been, if you want to be here, if you want to be successful, these are the things you have to do. This is how you have to present yourself. This is who you have to be. You know, don't have any weaknesses, don't have any flaws. You come to work and you be this person, and you see people put on their work persona. I think it's interesting because we're seeing increasing amounts of pushback on that. Is it a healthy concept? Is it even good for the workplace? We're trying to achieve more authenticity in the things that we develop, the companies that exist. Why all this artifice? Is it serving us? So there's a lot of shift happening, and there is a lot more to come.
Yeah, one of the reasons I bring up generational diversity is that there was a time, and I've shared this with you before, that I was in a workforce where I was really the only one of my generation. And so it was the generation before me that pretty much dominated everything about that workplace, the culture, everything. And I can remember just feeling so frustrated. And then I ended up transitioning and went to work for a company where everybody was the average 5 years younger than me. I was the old guy suddenly. And I got to be honest, though, there were some differences that were very nice. Oh, it's so refreshing that I'm around these people that are younger and they're not 20 years older than me. But I will say that some of the unhealthy work habits and approaches still persisted. And so for whatever reason, yeah, and I don't know if it's because again, where I see the generational differences really playing out, and you nailed it. It's really in the perspectives, the worldviews that we're bringing, and how that almost creates a different language. And so one person will say one thing, and someone else thinks they're saying something totally different. Like, no, that's not what I mean. But they never even get to that point. Very rarely do colleagues of different generations that are having this conflict ever get to the point where they see, okay, so that's really what you're saying. They just shut down. They put up a wall. And that's what in Tim Elmore's book, New Kind of Diversity, he talks about the importance of building bridges, not walls, between the generations that are represented in the workforce. But I love how you address it in your book as well. So perhaps my favorite title of any chapter in your book is chapter 5, which is Eliminate Bureaucracy and Stop Wasting Employee Time. And you touch on one of the, I think, one of the biggest time wasters that there can be in an organization, that's meetings. Now, I say that at the same time, one of the people that I most respect, one of my favorite organizational health experts, and he's really kind of the pioneer of that field, Patrick Lencioni, says that meetings are the most important activity in an organization. However, he also wrote a book called Death by Meeting. So he gets it. But he, in that book, said that the most painful yet underestimated problem of modern business is bad meetings. And so I have another friend named Juliet Fund that will also be interviewing for this Make Work Better video series. And she addresses meetings in her book this way. Her book's called A Minute to Think. She says meetings should be our collaborative payoff after solo work. Now, I think most of us can agree that meetings can be unnecessarily draining and counterproductive when they're not done well. I'm curious, in your opinion, why do so many managers seem to be addicted to meetings?
That's a very interesting question. I think that managers have very busy existences. And so for them, I think their relationship with meetings can be a little bit different than your typical individual contributor. A lot of managers that I don't know about you, have a whole brick wall of meetings. Like that is their schedule. In fact, what I find is that they have this funny thing that they do where they fill the whole day up with meetings, and then they see post work as their productivity time. So they'll be working from 5 to 7:30, and that's their time when they're executing on something, and they'll spend the day just kind of going back and forth. That's really not sustainable for everybody. That's not where we're trying to go here. And so I think that that it's easy to just say yes to all of these things and then just kind of show up, be yourself, and, hope for the best. But if you think about how much time and how much money is wasted on, something that's unplanned and unintentional, it's really, it's just a crime, right? It's not something that we can allow. And it's very frustrating for everybody else involved. Everybody else doesn't want to see you just show up and wing it. If we're not here for a purpose, then why are we here? I find that the best meetings are maybe things that you wouldn't necessarily label a meeting, but they are more situationally driven as opposed to routine in nature. So if I know that I need to talk to my colleague and I've worked through the document, I have a couple of questions for them, I've figured out all the answers that I know, and now I need to have a 15-minute conversation with you to discuss, that's a very good convening. And maybe in some cases, it might be a couple of people, but a lot of the best meetings are impromptu and they're with groups of 3 or less where we can really talk. I find people are usually pretty satisfied with that because they can contribute, they can get the information they need, they're in, they're out, they're on their way. It's the routine meetings that tend to eat up a ton of time. So here's what I recommend is look over the schedule, set your one-on-ones to the side because those are non-negotiable. We have to do one-on-ones. We have to make sure we're doing a good job checking in and supporting each individual on the team. The other meetings, take a look at them and kind of rank them. Say, okay, here are the most productive, here are the least productive, and then try to make some cuts or some consolidations. If you're able to do that, that can buy you a lot of time. And even if you cut 2 out of the week, it's great. And I'll just tell you, it is a life transforming experience to go from having 7 or 8 meetings a day to having 2 or 3 meetings a day. It's worth the effort. If you can do it, I highly recommend.
Yeah, that's good. Even when you're not an employee, meetings can get out of control. I remember complaining once, probably not once, many times to my wife about the abundance of meetings I had on my schedule. And I think there was one client for 1 week that had scheduled me. And it's not that I need to be there every meeting, but they had me on the schedule for 13 meetings. This is a client. This isn't an employer. And
Yeah.
I was just getting so frustrated. She gave me a really good sort of standard to go by, which is she said, honestly, unless the meetings are absolutely necessary, if you're in a season where there's just going to be a lot of meetings, she said, try to just have one meeting in the first part of the day and then one meeting in the second part. And you can kind of flex around those, but make
Sure.
that sort of your standard for reduction. And so I have tried that. Some days I do better with that standard than others, but it does make a big difference to not overfill your schedule because you're right, managers have a tendency to have all the meetings. And I can remember being invited by one of these managers I'm thinking of to a lot of different meetings. And I realized later on that every meeting that I was at that he was also on, he would say, okay, I just left this other meeting or I'm about to go into this other meeting. And I realized I know what his job description is. His job
Yeah,
description is to be in meetings all day.
that's correct. A lot of people see themselves that way, and it's not productive. And there's this sort of like, throw spaghetti at the wall and see what sticks. Like, you're here just in case we want you to absorb the information. That's not well planned, and that we just don't have time for that. We're way too busy to just sort of like show up and hope for the best.
Yeah, one of the other, in addition to meetings, because that's always been something I've recognized for years now, for decades even, as being just something that most companies just don't do well. But another thing that's not talked about as much, I mean, it's talked about sometimes in one-to-one meetings, but this is also in the same chapter, eliminate bureaucracy and stop wasting employee time. You talk about bottlenecks, and you mentioned 2 specifically. You mentioned the ego bottleneck and the chaos bottleneck. Now break those down for me.
An ego bottleneck you see really common. It goes back to our micromanager. If there are cases where somebody is saying, I have to see it personally every time, I don't want this to go to the client, I don't want this to go to so-and-so without my approval, that's an ego bottleneck. If you're a good, effective manager, you should be able to communicate what types of reviews need to happen, what the standards are for anything that occurs, and then those pieces should be able to go on. If you're just saying, I want to see it, what you're really saying is, I probably didn't tell you everything I needed to tell you. And so I'm going to figure that out in this chaotic review that I do at the end of the process. So watch out for those, pull them out of your process. If something's flowing through a single person, the only reason that should happen is if it's for a very specific reason, because they have a very specific role. So if there's any other reason that's happening, then try to eliminate those. The chaos bottleneck happens when you don't have enough planning. So a lot of businesses are pretty chaotic. We have a general idea of here's what we want, but we don't break it down and we don't actually allocate all of the time that it takes for all of the steps. So for example, if you need a certain type of person to participate in a project, and you need their specific skill set, but you haven't figured out, okay, exactly when is that going to occur, and you haven't given them advance notice that that's when you need them to participate, then you're going to come in hot and say, I need this tomorrow. And they're not going to be ready to give it to you tomorrow. And they're not going to want to do that either, because they didn't know that this was going to happen. So you can avoid that by just planning things out. I think a lot of times people don't want to accept how much time things are going to take. And so instead of really giving an appropriate duration for each step in the process, they just set a big milestone. They say, we want to be done on the 21st. And then come hell or high water, we're trying to figure out how to do that, but we get stuck all the time over the course of the project. Usually what I see happen is the project does launch at the same time it would have been projected to do so, but it's a much more chaotic process getting there, which is not fun for anybody.
Yeah, and what's the impact on just the garden variety worker at that company to be dealing with these bottlenecks? I mean, is that, because again, we think about things like meetings, we think about micromanaging, and obviously this could be the ego bottleneck in particular, a symptom of a micromanagement atmosphere. But yeah, I can just look back on my career and think the times I'm just like, I think I may be done with this company or with this project. I'm thinking
Yeah,
bottlenecks were kind of the thing that nobody thought of as being the potential cause for that kind of
it's a big
frustration.
contributor to burnout, right? Because
Mhm.
you're rushing, get something onto somebody's desk, and then you're waiting. And then not only did you exhaust yourself doing that rushing, that energy, that big burst, but now you're frustrated because did that matter? Did my extra effort and my extra, elbow grease amount to anything? And then two, now I'm waiting for something that I need, and that's very frustrating. So I know everybody wants to go fast. I know everybody is very excited, but if we plan it out a little bit better, if people know what's coming, they are much less frustrated, and it can help alleviate the burnout.
Yeah, that makes sense. Kind of the backbone of my book on this subject matter is something I call intentional leader development. And what I love about your book is that you really, even though it seems like it's venting from the employee's perspective, you really wrote this book for leaders. And on the back
Yeah.
of the book, it says, this is the book your employees want you to read. And
Yes.
I echo that. And I'll be honest with you, I have had issues just with my own workplace culture, and may have been about to make some decisions that weren't going to contribute to workplace health, but that were in fact going to make things worse. And I came across something in your book and I thought, ooh, I need to rethink that decision if what I'm reading here is really true. And so it kind of gave me pause. So just literally the first day I had this book helped me with making my workplace better. And shoot, I'm the one that wrote the book, Make Work Better, and I was about to make it worse. I needed another book called Happy at Work to set me on the right course. So, and speaking of that, so I mentioned how you wrote this book really for leaders. How should leaders use this book? And what's the net result going to be to their company and their productivity?
There are different ways that you can use the book. So if you're sort of a purist and you want to read from cover to cover, I promise you that you will leave the book with like lots of ideas for things that you can do. And also, I think what people tell me is they feel a sense of kinship once they've read the book. They feel seen, they feel recognized, and they feel like they're not as alone in their organization trying to advocate for change. Also, if you have a current problem that you're trying to work through, a culture issue, or it could be something else, it could be a productivity issue that's really a culture issue, look through the index, look through the chapter table contents, and see if that topic is covered, because we really have tried to run across many, many topics. So there's a lot there. And then one other way that you can do it is you can say, okay, I'm going to pick sort of a theme. I can't tackle all of these things. Sometimes in your organization, you just know this isn't the time for that. I need to focus on another area. Pick a specific chapter, focus on that chapter. And if you're able to pull off some of the techniques in there, then it'll have a good overall impact on the culture without being so demanding on you. There's only so much one person can do at a time. So I don't recommend trying to do everything at once. It depends on your role. You've got to think about what's realistic for you. And what do I want to prioritize? It's a healthier approach.
Yeah, and you might not say this, but I'll say it. I also think that every company for which this is an issue or a concern, and that should be every company, quite frankly, even those that win
Yes.
awards on culture. Believe me, I've done
Yep.
the work for companies that have said, "Oh, we're the 14th best place in this very large city to work for," and I got there, it was a terrible place to work. It's like who's
Yeah,
giving these awards away?
pretty common.
But I would say that any company that has an HR head or a culture champion or somebody that's head of culture at the very minimum needs to get this book. But um, if a company is looking to make their workplace what it needs to be for the future, or if they just currently have problems that they're recognizing the symptoms are already rearing their ugly heads, I think that every member of the leadership team of a company needs to get this. They need to go through it together and be like, okay, guys, before our next leadership team meeting, let's read chapters, whatever, and let's bring to the table what our ideas are to implement. Like, I think it's that important because if 2021 even taught us anything with great resignation, quiet quitting, and even though it's changing a little bit, it's still never going to go back to what it was. It still is a workers' market, even if the economy tanks a little bit. I can just tell you, employees are not willing to come in and just say yes to everything and yes to other people's terms anymore. Employees are definitely have a lot more power, have a lot more leverage, and I think that the smarter companies and the ones that will continue and be sustained will continue to see that. So this is why I say again, if you're a company and you care about the future of your company and being more employee friendly, every member of your leadership team needs to get it covered, whether it's 6 people, 10 people, whatever, get it, go through it for a season, come and meet about it and say, this is what we're going to implement. Make sure that you make change because this book was written to make an impact. It wasn't just written because it has good stuff and it has really good stuff in it, but it was written to make an impact. So Robyn, where can people get the book?
You can get the book anywhere. So it's available from all major retailers right now. You can get the paperback, you can get the ebook, which works on all your e-readers, and the audio book is also available. So any audio platform where you typically get your audiobooks, it is there.
Awesome. This may be a daunting or a general question, but what else do you have on the horizon?
So I've just finished a video series where I went through all of the tips in the book. I'm actually just trying to get the last couple videos. We did 100 videos and cover each one of the topics in the book. So if you want to check that out, that's on my TikTok. It's labeled Corporate Culture Fixes. My next step is I'm going to do some role plays of each one of these because I find that they're very popular and they're a fun way to approach the topics. We did the serious way to approach it, which is I explain each one of the topics. But now I want to kind of show some examples of that. What does that look like when the boss is doing the micromanaging or when you're in those exhaustive meetings? So I'm kicking that off pretty soon. And so it'll be 100 days of that. Yeah, it'll be on TikTok. I'll have it all in a playlist so you can check them out. And I think, when it happens in real life, you can't, it's real. So you have to react to it and you have to deal with the politics and this and that. When it's in a little piece of satire, you can just laugh and you can say, gosh, it's so true. Like my boss does act like this, and it is ridiculous. We can't always recognize the ridiculousness of some of these corporate situations, but when it's removed and it's in a safe space, you can.